Thank you for joining us. It's my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the IUCN Australian Committee and the Australian Key Biodiversity Areas National Coordination Group. I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all meeting today and pay my respects to the people, cultures and elders past and present. Happy now to pass on to James Watson from the University of Queensland, Professor James Watson. And joining James will be Dr. Anna McCallum from BirdLife Australia and Janice Chanson from Rewild. Okay, over to you, James.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for organising this as well. My name's James Watson. I'm on Bundjalung country and I want to acknowledge traditional owners of the land on the country I'm on. I'm the chair of the Key Biodiversity Area National Coordination Group, and today we're going to be covering three things. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I'm going to give a brief introduction about protected areas and how well we're going in terms of conserving biodiversity based on a bit of science that has been published recently. And then Anna, who is the secretary of the KBA National Coordination Group, will be then talking about KBAs in detail and what the process for identification is, explaining the history of them. And then we'll go to Janice, who will then talk about how KBAs can guide current conservation efforts in Australia, especially around 30 by 30. And then hopefully we'll have time for lots of questions. Next slide, please. So Australia has done a remarkable job in protecting land and seas. As of early 2026, almost a quarter of the continent, the terrestrial continent, is under some form of protected area. And in the marine zone, over 50% of Australia's marine protected areas are under protection. Next slide, please. So a key question then is, well, how well is this estate doing? It's obviously very large, but is it actually capturing important elements of biodiversity, threatened species and threatened ecosystems in particular? So we've been trying to ask this question for decades. Next slide, please, Janice. So this is a paper I led with Hugh Possingham and many other colleagues 16 years ago, first asking the question, how well is the Australian terrestrial reserve system going? And in 2010, the answer was really poor. So that awful looking graph on the right of my screen, at least, shows you three different things. The squares are basically showing how much proportion of threatened species are being captured by the current NRS, including the number of gap species, the proportion of species that are not captured at all in the protected area system. The null model is basically showing if you randomly through protected areas everywhere, how well would that capture threatened species? And then the optimum model using Marxan, how well could have we done? And this piece of science showed 16 years ago that the Australian protected area state was almost as bad as a null model, and that we are just if you randomly place your protected areas, you would capture threatened species effectively. As effectively as you've done it randomly. So that's a bad result 16 years ago. The Australian government recognised this at the time. So Peter Garrett, the ex-Midnight Oil frontman, was our Minister for Environment then, and in 2010 really made a push to try and actually understand that the protected area state is not covering important biodiversity areas. So he came up with this strategy with his team, obviously, called Australia's Strategy for the National Reserve System 2009 to 2030. And in it, it really makes the key point around protected area design and selection, saying you've got to actually prioritise areas for biodiversity conservation. We can't just be better than random. We have to actually start targeting species and ecosystems. Next slide, please. So we've reevaluated how the protected area state is going, looking at data up to 2022. So between 2010 and 2022 in a paper we've recently published, and the link is here in the slides, and I'm happy to share it with you and take any questions on notice around this stuff. But it's basically showed that in that 12-year period after Peter Garrett actually released that document, there's been an enormous growth in the protected area state. You can see the every 2-year growth patterns, and you see in particular Indigenous protected areas in Western Australia and Northern Territory and South Australia really did grow a lot in that period. So we saw on land a growth between 12.8% to 22.3%. Increase in coverage in protected areas. So again, next slide, please. A key question is, okay, well, how well did this growth capture threatened species? And unfortunately, it wasn't great. So again, if you look at the slide, the graph on the left, the grey area at the back shows the growth in the protected area state over the period, and those lines show how much actual coverage is happening with threatened species. And you start to see basically only almost 2% increase in the average, species, more threatened species protected by this growth in the protected area state. And the median increased from 20% to 23%. So basically, despite an almost doubling in the protected area state, or even, and even more so, you're seeing an almost flat line increase in terms of how much threatened species coverage and ecological threatened ecosystem coverage occurring. So it's a repeat of the past. We're actually grabbing lots of land, but we're not targeting important biodiversity areas. Next slide, please. So another key finding that we found was 160 threatened species, including 40 critically endangered species, were not found in any protected area across Australia. So again, we see that this coverage is actually not ideal. If you look at why this is happening, it's pretty obvious. There's the figure on the left, which with all the colour, shows where the growth occurred between 2010 and 2022. And you can see areas that had already good levels of representation in the protected area network increased the most over that 12-year period. Areas that had very little coverage in 2010 got very little additional protected areas post that period. The map on the right is where threatened species occur in Australia. These are just range maps intersected. So this is a hotspot map, and obviously just looking at these maps, we are protecting areas that have low percentages of threatened species, and we are not protecting areas that have high percentages of threatened species. Next slide, please. So we're in a same situation that Peter Garrett was in. The good news is that the recent minister basically said we've got to do better. Again, she mentioned that she committed to 30 by 30 early on when the Albanese government was first elected, and over the last few years, the federal government and state governments have combined to come up with these strategic plans around achieving 30% by 2030, which is again good news. There's a real focus on trying to do better. Next slide, please. And so if you look at the recent strategic plan that was released by the federal government, there's two key principles emerge from it. Obviously, areas are effectively managed and participation by First Nations people is supported. So that's principle one. But principle two is really around areas of particular importance for biodiversity are also targeted. So these two foundational principles are hopefully driving the 30 by 30 agenda. Next slide, please. So that's good news. We've got a commitment. The IUCN, which is the International Union for Nature Conservation, have basically said if you want to achieve target 3 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is the protected area target, which is 30 by 30, basically you have to target important areas of biodiversity. And they gave guidance, which is this link here. And you'll see these are the places that you should all really focus on. And where these arrows are pointing to, and the reason why we're talking about KBAs through this lens is that half of all the things that the IUCN has said we must target to achieve better outcomes for biodiversity under target 3 of the GBF are criteria under the key biodiversity area. So those arrows are literally the same things that KBAs are. So that's why we want to make the link between 30 by 30 important biodiversity areas and KBAs, because that's basically what the international framework has told us what is the commitment. So I'm going to stop now and hand over to Anna, who's going to dive into what KBAs are and the history. And then, as I say, Janice will then lead us home around how do we link these two things together? The protected area network not performing very well, but there's opportunities for better ways to actually get biodiversity outcomes. So thanks. Over to you, Anna.
Thanks, James. So my name's Anna McCallum. I work at BirdLife Australia, where I coordinate key biodiversity areas at BirdLife. So my aim is to identify sites for birds and make sure they're protected. But I'm also on the National Coordination Group, where I'm really interested in expanding this program to a range of other taxa and groups. So I guess I'm the nuts and bolts of KBAs. What are key biodiversity areas? Well, they are sites that contribute significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity. And they're identified using globally standardised criteria. And that is really important because it means that they're objective, they're transparent, and that standard can be compared across countries and regions. It's a site-based tool, so they must have a delineated boundary, but they're not necessarily formally protected areas, and that nor should they necessarily be protected or formally protected. But the aim of KBAs is to provide decision makers with improved understanding of why particular sites are important for biodiversity. Next slide. So there's a long history of KBAs. Back in 2004, the IUCN called on the community to come up with and agree on a methodology to identify important sites using existing tools, data sets and approaches. And to kind of, next slide, to get to the KBA standard, there was a long process of consultation. There were a number of, I guess, between 2012 and 2016, this consultation involved a number of technical working groups. There were 2 phases of consultation, and there was also a lot of debate within the scientific literature. And I guess it was important that the global standard didn't just recognise those existing approaches like important bird areas. It was also important to include criteria around ecological integrity and systematic conservation, such as irreplaceability. Next slide. So in 2016, the KBA standard was published. It includes criteria and thresholds, along with delineation guidelines. It's applicable to species and ecosystems in terrestrial, freshwater and marine environments, and it builds on those existing approaches to identify important sites. And this is really important. It was the first time that the conservation community had agreed on a common approach to identifying sites. Next slide. Along with the KBA standard, 12 of the world's nature conservation organisations formed the KBA partnership with the aim of identifying and protecting those KBAs. And the BirdLife International took on the role of kind of administering the global secretariat in terms of sharing data on and managing that process of identification. Next slide. So within each country, national coordination groups are responsible for coordinating that process within countries. And Australia was one of the first countries to establish a national coordination group back in 2017. So our national coordination group has broad representation across NGOs, but also scientists and government. And the aim of the NCG is really to coordinate that process of identification and to promote their use in Australia. Next slide. So I guess now just get to some of the kind of more technical part about the KBA criteria. There are 11 criteria, but they're broadly grouped into these categories. So criteria A is about recognising sites that support significant populations of species or ecosystems that are threatened. Criteria B is aims to capture geographically restricted biodiversity. Criteria C is about ecological integrity. Criteria D has biological processes. So this captures sites that, say, for migratory species stopovers or breeding aggregations. And criterion E is about systematic conservation, so irreplaceability and complementarity. And as James mentioned, all of these criteria are those elements that were identified by the IUCN as really important for important areas of biodiversity. So I'll just dive into one of the criteria just to show you how you can use the criteria to nominate a KBA. So they're very quantitative. So there's thresholds that must be met to qualify as a KBA. And it depends on the So which criteria you apply in terms of threatened species depends on the status of the species. So for critically endangered and endangered species, you only require 0.5% of the global population of a species to qualify as a KBA. For vulnerable species, a site requires 1% of the global population. So I guess you can see here that you need information on both the population at a site, but you also need information on the global population to apply the criteria. A1C and A1D are used, have even lower thresholds, and these are for species that are threatened due to past or current declines. And criteria A1E are sites that include the entire population of a critically endangered or endangered species. So those are those Alliance for Zero extinction sites, which you may have heard of, AZEs. And obviously, making sure that we've identified those will, is really important to prevent extinction. So I'll give you a little example of how you might apply a criteria. We recently assessed Christmas Island, and the coconut crab occurs there, and it's one of the most important important locations for the coconut crab. It has a really wide distribution, so we know it occurs on islands all across the Indian and Pacific Oceans, but Christmas Island is a really important place for it. We know we have estimates of the population at Christmas Island, but we don't have a global estimate of the population. So we used area of occupancy to assess this species, and based on that, it has 0.36% of the global population. Because it's a vulnerable species that's declining, it only 0.2%. It only requires 0.2% of the global population to meet the criteria. Next slide. So along with the coconut crab, there are a number of endemic species that occur on Christmas Island, and in total we included 18 triggers in this nomination. Unfortunately, the reason we reviewed this site was because the Christmas Island shrew was recently declared extinct, and so managing this area is really important to avoid future extinctions. And the Abbott's booby and the Christmas Island blind snake are critically endangered species that have their entire distribution on this island. Next slide. So a really important part, apart from, I guess, scoping triggers and showing that species meet the criteria, the other important element to KBA nomination is site delineation. It is a site-based tool, so it's important to delineate a boundary. And the aim of delineating sites is to provide the best conditions for the persistence of biodiversity for which the site is important. And so as much as possible, they should be ecologically relevant, but it's also important that they're practical for management. But again, KBA boundaries don't necessarily have any prescriptive management implied. Next slide. So the other important criteria for KBAs is that there must be the possibility of some kind of management across the area that supports the persistence of the biodiversity elements. And this is a really important part. Well, this is an important element for the Australian National Coordination Group, because the KBA criteria uses these quantitative thresholds. As a site gets larger, it becomes easier to meet the criteria. So it's really important that we consider this manageability kind of in the Australian landscape. It's also important, I guess, because conservation actions are more likely to be kind of effective if we consider this manageability criteria. Next slide. I just want to jump in, I guess, with that James's introduction with obviously First Nations are critical to conservation in Australia, and KBAs can really complement Indigenous-led conservation, and that provides international recognition of places, animals and plants. and it's an opportunity for knowledge sharing and potentially to attract funding. And it's not just in Australia, KBAs are global, so you know, a lot of these, they're being used in Canada in a similar way with First Nations people. So just to go over the proposal process pretty broadly, anyone can nominate a KBA, ideally through the National Coordination Group. But as Janice will kind of take us through, we'd really like to do this systematically and more comprehensively rather than kind of on an ad hoc basis. I guess the process is about scoping a site, applying the criteria, working with stakeholders to delineate a boundary. From there, it goes to a regional focal point who reviews proposals, and then it goes to the Global Secretariat who make that final check. And the final step is that it gets published on the World Database of Key Biodiversity Areas. Maybe next slide. So this is kind of the database that houses all of the KBAs across the world. And it also, there's a link there if you want to go and have a look. And it's important that it feeds into tools for business as well, things like IBAT that Janice will mention. And I think that is it for me. Thank you. Janice, over to you.
Thanks, Anna. So my name's Janice Chanson and I work for Rewild. We are a nature NGO and I manage our Australasia program. So this afternoon, I'm going to take you through how KBAs can guide conservation efforts in Australia, including 30 by 30. So James has already given us the history and where we've found ourselves with what we've already done in developing our protected area network and the shortfalls we've found ourselves with. Anna's given us a description of how KBAs work, and just to let you know, she very loosely went through the criteria there because of timing, but it is something that we're planning later this year to have a training course for KBAs. And so anyone here that's interested in doing a training workshop on KBAs and how they can be implemented, please let us know and we can give you some details. So firstly, let's look at where KBAs sit in the scheme of things with the Global Biodiversity Framework. Obviously, Australia is signed up to the Global Biodiversity Framework. There's many targets, and KBAs in particular come up in a number of them. And so the red list, the IUCN red list that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, the red list of threatened species, as well as the red list of ecosystems, feeds into the KBA identification of KBAs, as Anna has shown. And these feed into the various targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework. For example, Target 1, spatial planning to halt biodiversity loss. So when considering our spatial planning, we're thinking about key biodiversity areas. Also, Target 2, effectively restoring degraded areas. For example, where are these key biodiversities that are degraded and need restoration for the protection of these species? Target 3, and this is one we're specifically looking at today, and it's the one we're all familiar with and we know well as a 30 by 30 target, which conserves 30% of land, waters and seas. And Target 4 is another one that we overlap with quite significantly with key biodiversity areas in our discussions today. And that is the zero extinction target, as we like to call it, which is the halting extinctions and protecting threatened species. And KBAs can be really instrumental in doing that, and we can show that in a minute. As well as Target 14, mainstream biodiversity into policy and practice. Sometimes, and actually quite often, people will come to me and ask, where are the places we need to protect? Where are the species that need protection within Australia? And KBAs can help advance that discussion. Target 15, businesses to reduce and disclose impacts. So IBAT that Anna referred to earlier is a database that IUCN has created that puts together all of this various biodiversity data, such as key biodiversity areas, red listing data, green status data. There's a lot of information in there, and it's something that corporates can subscribe to and give them their information that they need in order to either do investments or to place their own sites for where they're going to do work. And increasingly, I've had, for example, some of the interdevelopmental banks internationally asking, for example, in South America, where should we be investing to avoid biodiversity loss? We would like to see sites that we should be avoiding investing in for development if it's going to be detrimental to biodiversity. So I've had those sorts of queries within South America, and increasingly that will be happening in Australia as well, as we know with the new EPBC Act as well, and these sites that we're trying to avoid any development, for example. So target 15 is really quite an important one, and it's something I'm finding increasingly that corporates are asking for this data. They don't want to invest in a company that is doing detrimental things to species protection, and they're really looking for this information, as well as the TNFD, which is all the Nature Positive Initiative, and its metrics is the TNFD, and many of these other metrics as well are really calling out for these key biodiversity area site designations. So, and target 21 is biodiversity data made available for conservation planning. So it comes up in a lot of the various targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework. But the one we really wanted to focus on today was target 3, what we know as the 30 by 30 target. And for those of you that aren't familiar or need a reminder, the target 3 is ensuring and enabling that by 2030, at least 30% of terrestrial inland water and of coastal and marine areas, especially areas of particular importance for biodiversity. And that's what we're really trying to show today, is how key biodiversity areas can highlight those areas of particular importance for biodiversity, ensuring they can effectively conserved and managed. And Anna discussed how KBAs take into consideration manageability as well, and delineation, systems of protected areas, and other effective area-based conservation measures. So it's not necessarily that this is advocating for these to become protected areas, but knowing that these are sites that need to be managed for the benefit of conservation, and that can involve lots of different management types. And the key indicator for this particular target 3, or actually not the key indicator, one of the indicators, is protected area coverage of key biodiversity areas. So it is something that is requested by the CBD that we report on. So what countries are already using KBAs to guide their 30 by 30 approach? There's quite a few here in our list: Bolivia, Brazil, Canada. I won't go through them all. I will highlight Canada, though. I will go and show you in a second what that looks like, because it is a country that's quite similar to ours, not as huge population, but a very large landmass. And so we have very similar needs and a vast space to be working in as well as South Africa as well, that's gone through quite a comprehensive approach to identifying them as well. And then moving towards using KBAs, we've got a few new countries on board as well. And every month almost, I'm hearing about another country that's coming on board with using KBAs to guide their 30 by 30. So where have comprehensive assessments of KBAs already been completed? As you can see, there's quite a lot they have planned. We have the green ones are those that are completed. At the moment, Australia is coloured in orange, where a comprehensive assessment is ongoing. I think that's kind of generous. I would actually consider it more planned. I think they were very kind to us there. So I think maybe they were trying to measure on our enthusiasm and ambition there. But yes, we very much are hoping, as part of the National Coordination Group, that we can absolutely get a comprehensive assessment of KBAs ongoing in Australia. So let's have a look at Canada and what they have done so far. They haven't finished just yet, but they're well on their way and they're doing a really excellent job. And we have had a few chats to them to get some of their advice on the best ways forward. So this is Canada's current map, where they currently stand. This is their dashboard of their progress. And so the really interesting thing that I like looking at here is they've really brought in quite a vast selection of species groups. And you'll see at the moment with Australia, we're very much focused on birds. They have really tried to be very inclusive with taxonomic groups. It's led very much by vascular plants. 195 vascular plants trigger a key biodiversity area. And keep in mind that a KBA can have multiple species as a trigger. It's not one species for one KBA. Ideally, you're trying to identify a KBA that it will have multiple species that are important and a trigger for that particular KBA. We've got 46 amphibians and reptiles. Invertebrates, we have 80, which is fantastic. And really impressive is they have 30 fungi and lichens, which is often overlooked in many of the other countries and their KBAs. And they have a variety of different, whether they are in progress at the moment. The ones in progress, they're at the blue dots, so they're currently writing those up, and they're currently accepted, the ones in yellow. So they've got 774 species that meet KBA criteria. Although Canada's a big country, it's not nearly as diverse as Australia, so we would have expect a lot more species to be trigger species for us. It's such a cold climate up there. They don't have a whole lot of species in that middle to northern range, unlike us that is in a particularly habitable environment. So that is what the Canadians are doing at the moment. They're doing a really excellent job, and there's a lot we can learn from them. So this is what KBAs currently look like in Australia. When KBAs first were sort of done in Australia, it was very much bringing on the legacy important bird areas. So that was part of the new standard being adopted, that BirdLife International made an agreement that the important bird areas could be incorporated as key biodiversity areas, with the idea that they would be reviewed within that first 9 years. And so we had 314 IBAs, important bird areas, that came in from 2009. And then since then, we've added 35 Alliance for Zero Extinction sites in 2018. And I'll go over exactly what an Alliance for Zero Extinction site is in a minute. So this is where we currently stand. And this work has been led by BirdLife Australia, and so far has done a really good job at establishing what the key biodiversity areas are in Australia for birds, which is fantastic, and they've been leading the way. But what's missing is our other groups, and they've really shown us what we can do and how we can progress by incorporating many of the other taxonomic groups. So BirdLife is now going through those KBAs for birds and checking them against the current KBA criteria. So as I mentioned, they were previously important bird areas. The criteria for the choosing important bird areas is slightly different for key biodiversity areas. So BirdLife now is going through carefully and just checking that each of those legacy important bird areas are indeed KBAs, and if need be, delineating them and also incorporating other taxonomic groups as much as possible. So what I want to do now is step back and say we've got a wonderful map so far of KBAs representing birds, and BirdLife's done a really good job with that. But James has also showed us that it isn't enough, and we're really missing where all our other species are, and they really are missing that protection. And so what we're trying to show here today is that KBAs give us that site-based global standard for conservation, just like the IUCN Red List is the global standard for threatened species, and has actually become the common, using our common assessment method, has become our standard as well for EPBC listings federally as well as by states. So just as we adopted that in 2016, the KBA criteria, if you look at many of our states, for example, New South Wales, if they're areas of outstanding biodiversity value, many of those criteria that we refer to in those state assessments are actually the same KBA criteria. So we're already doing this in states in different ways as well as federally, but we're not standardizing it around the KBA standard like we have for species with the common assessment method. So why do we suggest this is the right way forward at the moment? As James showed, we have our Achieving by 30 by 30 on land national roadmap, and we know that principle 2 in particular, areas of particular importance are within well-connected ecological representative systems of protected areas, protected and conserved areas. That is our focus. And of late, you would have heard, all of you in the media, that our government and all of us are very much committed to zero extinctions. And that comes through also conserving land. So the government has made that commitment that it will aim to conserve 30% of Australia's landmass in an attempt to protect its unique wildlife. So the government, and many of you here, I'm sure, have made that connection yourselves, that in order to protect our biodiversity, we need to use our 30 by 30 target wisely. So we stepped back as part of the National Coordination Group probably about a year ago. We were kind of getting a little bit frustrated with our progress with KBAs. BirdLife was leading in the bird realm, but we weren't making much progress with the other taxonomic groups and ensuring they were also covered in that KBA network. And the main reason for that is essentially the NCG is people that all have jobs that don't involve doing key biodiversity areas. James, myself, and Anna very much do this off the sides of our desk, and most people in the NCG are all similar. There's no one in Australia whose primary job is to build a comprehensive network of KBAs. And so we sat back and thought, how can we do this that best deals with what we need to do in terms of what we need, how we need to address the issues that James has raised with 30 by 30, and how we can do that by using the National Coordination Group and all the partners we already have that are part of this. And so we got together and came up with this 5-phased approach, because we know that money doesn't come out of thin air. We realize that to do a comprehensive assessment of everything all at once would be quite an investment, and we really want to show that there's some key low-hanging fruit that be really helpful to aim for now with key biodiversity areas to really try and aim to achieve some of our targets. So I'll go through each of these ones to slide by slide. So phase 1, we really wanted to identify KBAs for the 110 priority species in the government's Threatened Species Action Plan. So that was published a few years ago. It identified 110 priority species. As you can see on the left there, 22 birds, 21 mammals, 9 fish, etc. Those 110 species, we've already decided that they are our priority species, but we don't yet know the priority sites that we need to conserve and protect in order to make sure that that Threatened Species Action Plan is successful. And so our very first phase aims to identify the KBAs for all 110 priority species. Phase 2 is then looking at this particular criteria, which is A1E that Anna referred to briefly. This is looking at what we call Alliance for Zero Extinction sites. So Alliance for Zero Extinction has been around for quite some time, over 20 years. And the idea of an alliance, a zero extinction site, an Alliance for Zero Extinction site, it is the last remaining site for a species that is endangered or critically endangered, such that if you lose that site, you lose that species. And that is captured in the KBA criteria under A1E. And as you can imagine, they're obviously a real priority for us if we're going to meet that zero extinction target. If we don't make sure that that species is protected within that site, then we will lose that species globally. And this is not just in Australia, this is globally. So that would be our next phase 2. These are obviously really high priority species and high priority sites. Phase 3 is KBAs for all threatened species. So James and his team did an analysis just last year. It was published that was led by Michelle Ward, looking at where are the current protected areas and where are the threatened species, and found a massive gap. And so looking at those species that we have now identified through this analysis, knowing that they are highly restricted, but most of them don't occur within protected areas, thinking about how we can establish or determine KBAs for those species. So they're the ones that are still falling through the cracks. They're not necessarily 110 priority. They're not necessarily only occurring at one site, and so therefore AZEs, but they're highly threatened and they're not yet within covered within the protected area network. And this is giving you an example. This is the results of that paper, and you can see that 305 small range critically endangered species, 85,000 square kilometres, only about 1% of Australian land area we would need to protect in order to cover those 305 small range critically endangered species. 50% of the habitat present is outside the protected area states, and 39 species have none of their remaining habitat at all in the protected area estate. So they're obvious candidates for KBA designation. Phase 4 is once we've really dealt with our threatened species, we're targeting looking at criterion C, which is ecological integrity. So these are sites with intact ecological communities that maintain natural processes and have low human impact. So really thinking about how in Australia, we're still very, very lucky compared to many countries in the world that we have a lot of intact wilderness compared to many, and that we still have that opportunity to protect it now and maintain those intact ecosystems before it's too late. Just last week, I was in the US at Great Smokies National Park, and I was shocked. It was such a beautiful protected area, and I was shocked that 80% of that had been clear felled in the 1920s, and now it's a national park, and it has regenerated, and it is a beautiful park, but 25% of that park is now invasive plant species. This is the problem that we in Australia can avoid by identifying, protecting these really intact ecological communities now, and making sure that we can keep them intact for generations to come. And that's something that we are fortunate in Australia, that we still have that opportunity, and so many countries don't. So I think this is, for me, a really important one for us to look at, is doing a comprehensive assessment of ecosystems, looking at those that are still intact. So that's looking at criterion C. And then the last of our phases is phase 5. And this is looking at basically everything else that's fallen through, and really saying that we can have done a comprehensive assessment. So looking at all our 5 criteria, looking at species that may not yet have been caught within any of those 3 first phases, as well as the ecosystems that may not well be intact right now, but they are still very important for species, and that's across terrestrial, freshwater and marine realms. And reminding you that those other phases as well are looking also at terrestrial, freshwater and marine. We're not just looking at terrestrial. And if you look back at our, I've just looked forward here at our KBA map, the current KBAs there on that bottom left, there currently are no marine KBAs at all. We've only got terrestrial. We've really got a long way to go in that space with the marine. So what are our next steps? We need funding to support these next 5 phases. Why we are where we are is because we have a lot of very dedicated people who are very busy that don't have the time to be able to do this, and we really need to support a small coordination team managed by the National Coordination Group to get this work done. We have a proposal that outlines the process and the timing and the budget. So if anyone here is interested in hearing more about that, we would love to share that with you. And so who would take this forward? We are recommending a small coordination group managed by the National Coordination Group that works in consultation with experts from the National Specialist Group, so just last year, we established the Australian Species Specialist Group as part of the IUCN Species Survival Commission. That's our logo up the top right there. And so that's bringing together all of Australia's SSC experts, taxonomic experts who have that data on species where they occur as well as their populations, bringing together governments at the federal and state level, Indigenous groups, academia, NGOs, etc., bringing everyone together and managed by that small coordination team. And we would see that central coordination team working and then bringing people together in expert workshops to really identify where KBAs are, thinking about representation as well as corridors and connectivity as well. When would we like to do this? As soon as we possibly can, knowing that 2030 is only 4 more years away. We have another 6% to go before we reach 30% at the terrestrial. And so this is a real opportunity over the next couple of years to guide that last 6% to really be thinking about how can we really greatly improve our coverage of threatened species, and in particular to prevent extinctions. So finally, is my last slide. I think just bringing this all together, as James showed, we have our threatened species richness up there for, this is terrestrial species, apologies to the marine lovers out there. This is our current KBA network. You can see there's a disconnect, and even more so, we have our protected area network coverage on the right-hand side there. We have real disconnect here. We have a real opportunity to bring this together, make it cohesive such that we can protect species and protect ecosystems. So this is, I took this from the DQ website from 27th of March. And this is what the government has written. In addition to reaching 30%, it's important to protect and conserve the right land. Our networks of protected and conserved areas need to support important biodiversity, contribute to ecological representativeness, be well connected, and be effectively and equitably managed. And all 4 of those things are taken into consideration and are really the focus of key biodiversity areas. So we're really happy to see the government realizing that we do need to absolutely conserve the right land, and this is the right way to go about it. So that is the end of my presentation and our presentation today. And I just wanted to say thanks to James and Anna for this, and thank you very, very much to Sarah Turks as well for inviting us to present this webinar today. Really appreciate it, and to everyone for making the time to come today. We're really excited about continuing this discussion in July at the symposium that the IUCN Australian Committee is running in Sydney in July. So hopefully we'll see many of you there and we can continue this discussion.
And our emails are there. Please reach out if you want to have access to the PowerPoint or reports, or just want to chat about this stuff. We're all really passionate about this effort. So thank you for coming.
Thanks, everyone.